April 14th, 1945. On a hillside above the Ruhr Valley, an American sergeant poured coffee from a thermos and passed the cup to the man beside him. Down in the factory below, through a shattered window, a German officer was watching him do it. The German had been watching for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, more of his men had walked away into the woods than had died in some of the worst weeks on the Eastern Front. Not one American shell had fallen on his position. Not one American rifle had been raised in his direction. That was the problem. On the ridges across the valley, the Americans sat in the grass. They ate from ration tins. They smoked. They wrote letters home. Through his binoculars, he could see one of them laughing at something his neighbor had said. The officer lowered the binoculars. Somewhere behind him, a young corporal was quietly folding his uniform, preparing to walk away into the trees. The officer did not stop him. He no longer knew what he would be stopping him for. He had been trained his whole life to face an attack. Nobody had ever trained him for this. To understand how the German army arrived at this moment, you have to go back 8 months, to a summer when the answer still seemed obvious, when the way to break a trapped enemy was to charge him, and to a city on the western edge of France where that answer was about to cost the United States Army 10,000 men. August 1944, the Normandy breakout had cracked the German front like a drop plate. Patton's Third Army was racing east across France at 30 miles a day. The war smelled like victory. It smelled like Berlin by Christmas. But behind the American advance along the long Atlantic coast of Brittany, the ports still held. Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and the one that mattered most, Brest. Brest had a deep-water harbor. That sentence does not sound like much, but in August of 1944, it was the difference between an army that could keep fighting and an army that could not. Every drop of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every replacement engine still had to be dragged across the open beaches of Normandy. A working port would change everything, so the order came down, take Brest, take it fast. Patton flung his 6th Armored Division 200 miles across Brittany in a single lunging thrust, expecting to arrive before the Germans could dig in. His tanks reached the outskirts on August 7th, and they stopped. Brest was a fortress, not the loose, cinematic kind of fortress, the literal kind. Reinforced concrete, interlocking bunkers, steel doors, gun ports thick enough to shrug off a direct hit from a field gun. Hitler had declared it a Festung on the 19th of January that year. Fortress, one of 11 along the Atlantic Wall, ordered to be held to the last man, the last round, the last breath. And inside that fortress stood the man who intended to obey that order to the letter. His name was Hermann Bernhard Ramcke. He was 55 years old, a paratrooper general. He had jumped into Crete in 1941. He had fought under Rommel in the desert. He had commanded paratroopers on 3 continents, and none of it had humbled him. He believed in the war the way a priest believes in the sacraments. When the American breakout began, Ramcke was outside Brest with his 2nd Parachute Division. He could have stayed outside. He could have moved south, joined the retreat, saved his men. He did the opposite. He turned his division around and marched it back into the fortress, back through American armor already sealing the roads. He lost 350 men fighting his way through, and when he reached the gates of Brest, he walked in like a man entering a burning building on purpose. Because that was the doctrine. A Festung existed to bleed the enemy. The enemy would come. He would have to come. And every American soldier who fell trying to take the concrete would be a soldier who could not march on Berlin. Ramcke took command on August 12th. He stiffened the weaker infantry divisions with his paratroopers. He ordered every crane, every dock, every warehouse in the harbor prepared for demolition. And then he sat down to wait for the Americans to do exactly what he needed them to do. They obliged. The assault began on August 25th, 1944. Major General Troy Middleton commanded the 8th Corps, a calm, unflashy officer from Mississippi. He had 3 divisions in his hand: the 2nd Infantry, the 8th Infantry, the 29th Infantry, 75,000 American soldiers. The plan was straightforward. It was almost too straightforward. Overwhelming force, air support, artillery. Punch through the outer ring. Push into the city. Force a surrender. Middleton expected it to take days. It took 6 weeks. The outer defensive ring was not a line. It was a maze. Bunker, covering pillbox, covering trench, covering minefield. When American infantry seized one strong point, they discovered that a second strong point, 200 yards behind it, had already zeroed its guns on the ground they were now standing on. The Germans did not need brilliance. They needed concrete. They had concrete. Ramcke moved his best men to every sector that buckled. When the Americans found a soft spot, it hardened overnight. When they broke through a line, another line waited behind it. And when they finally reached the streets of Brest itself, they discovered something worse. Every road in the city was covered by German anti-tank guns and machine guns positioned in windows and cellars and rooftops. You could not cross a street and live. So the Americans stopped trying to cross streets. Engineers went forward under fire with satchel charges and blew holes through the walls of buildings. Then infantry moved through those holes, room to room, cellar to cellar, never stepping outside. An army that had crossed France at 30 miles a day was now measuring its progress in rooms. By the first week of September, the 8th Infantry Division had taken casualties so severe that Middleton pulled the entire division out of the line. The 2nd and 29th fought on alone. British crocodile tanks arrived, Churchills fitted with flamethrowers. On September 14th, 4 of them attacked Fort Montgomery. 3 were destroyed in the first hour. The attack was canceled. 2 days later, 6 crocodiles tried again. This time the fort fell. 80 German soldiers surrendered from inside it. 80 men from one fort that had cost days of fighting and 3 burned tanks. Eisenhower authorized maximum air support. Every bomber that could reach Brest was sent. The city that Ramcke had promised to hold began to disappear under the weight of high explosive. Blocks became rubble. Rubble became craters. Craters became new positions for German machine gunners who crawled out of the cellars and set up again. By September 17th, the Germans held only the submarine pens and a single fort on the western edge of the harbor. On September 19th, men of the 8th Division's 13th Infantry Regiment reached Ramcke's bunker. Brigadier General Charles Canham walked in to accept the surrender. Canham was not a man who impressed easily. He had come ashore at Omaha Beach on D-Day with the 116th Infantry. He had taken a bullet through the wrist in the first hour on that beach. He had refused evacuation. He had led his men off the sand with his arm in a sling, and he had earned the Distinguished Service Cross before most of the officers in Ramcke's bunker knew Brest existed. Ramcke looked at him. He was a general. Canham was only a brigadier, And according to the American officers present in the bunker that day, Ramcke, in the last theatrical gesture of a career built on theater, said the words, "A German general does not surrender," to an officer of lower rank. "Show me your credentials." Canham did not answer immediately. He turned. He looked at the doorway behind him. The doorway was full of American soldiers, unshaven, filthy, exhausted, uniforms black with smoke and old blood, their rifles slung, their eyes flat with 6 weeks of house-to-house killing. Canham gestured at them. "These," he said, "are my credentials." Ramcke looked at the soldiers in the doorway for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Very well, let us get on with the details." 38,000 German prisoners walked out of Brest. The Americans counted their own dead, 9,831 casualties. 3 divisions chewed to pieces. 6 weeks consumed. 6 weeks during which those same 3 divisions could have been driving east toward the German border. And the harbor they had bled for was gone. Ramcke had done his work too well. The cranes were twisted iron, the quays were rubble, the basins were choked with sunken ships. Not a single Allied supply vessel would ever dock at Brest. Not one. 75,000 men had attacked. Nearly 10,000 had been hit. 6 weeks had passed, and the prize was a ruin. Somewhere in the arithmetic of that disaster, a lesson was beginning to take shape. It had not yet been written down. It had not yet become doctrine. But the men who had crawled through the cellars of Brest understood it in their bones. They had done exactly what Ramcke wanted them to do. They had attacked a fortress head-on, and the fortress had bled them exactly the way a fortress was designed to bleed them. Every American casualty at Brest was a casualty Ramcke had budgeted for. Every burned tank, every dead sergeant, every 20-year-old rifleman lying in a French cellar with his eyes open. All of it was a line in a ledger that Berlin had drawn up the previous January. The Festung had done its job. The question nobody had asked yet, the question that was about to reshape the last year of the war in the West, was very simple. What happens if you don't attack? What happens if the fortress is there and the enemy is there, and the doctrine sits on the table between them waiting to be obeyed, and one side simply decides not to obey it? What happens if you look at Ramcke's concrete and Ramcke's paratroopers and Ramcke's promise to bleed you white, and you shrug and you walk around it and you leave him there? The answer to that question was 200 miles down the coast. 200 miles down the coast in a pair of ports called Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, 60,000 German soldiers were about to spend the next 9 months finding out. And what they discovered there would not have a name in any German field manual. It would not appear in any doctrine. It would not be something a Prussian officer academy had ever thought to teach. It would be the quiet, patient, unhurried sound of an American army that had learned in the ruins of Brest that the deadliest thing it could do to a trapped German garrison was nothing at all. The order arrived in the first week of September 1944, while the cellars of Brest were still burning. It came from Eisenhower's headquarters, and it contained a sentence that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier. The German garrisons isolated at Saint-Nazaire and Lorient. It read, "For the present merely be contained. It is unnecessary to reduce them by force of arms." Merely contained. 2 words that quietly rewrote the playbook. Not storm, not assault, not reduce. Contain them. Leave them behind their own wire. Walk away. It was a decision born from arithmetic, not from courage. The math at Brest had been ugly enough for any man with a pencil to read. 75,000 attackers, 10,000 casualties, 6 weeks, a ruined harbor, and Antwerp had just fallen on the 4th of September with its port intact. The Brittany harbors were no longer worth a single American life. So instead of 3 divisions, the Americans sent one. The 94th Infantry Division landed on Utah Beach on September 8th. They called themselves the Pilgrims. Their commanding officer was Major General Harry J. Maloney. His men had trained at Fort Custer in Michigan and Camp Phillips in Kansas. They had never seen combat. They were green. Maloney's orders were among the strangest of the entire war. Take responsibility for containing 60,000 German troops in 2 fortified ports. Lorient on the southern coast. Saint-Nazaire 50 miles to the southeast. His single division's fronts stretched across 450 miles of Breton coastline. 1 division, 450 miles, 60,000 trapped Germans. And do not attack them. Hold that number in your mind for a moment. 60,000. That is more men than Ramcke had commanded at Brest. And inside those 2 pockets sat officers as hard as any Germany had produced. Lorient was held by Lieutenant General Wilhelm Farnbacher, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a holder of the Knight's Cross. 25,000 men under his command. At Saint-Nazaire, Lieutenant General Hans Junk surrendered the following day, May 11th. 28,000 men. Artillery, ammunition, concrete, and Hitler's personal order ringing in their ears. Defend to the last, and nobody came to fight them. Maloney understood what he had. A green division on a thin front, with orders that did not require a battle. But his men needed to learn. He could not send them east to fight the real war without teaching them first what combat felt like. So he improvised. He sent patrols, small groups, a squad, a platoon, probing the German perimeter, testing the wire, drawing fire, learning where the machine guns were, and how fast the German artillery answered back. It was combat training conducted against a live enemy. Dangerous enough to teach, small enough to survive. On October 2nd, a patrol from K Company of the 301st Infantry walked into an ambush inside the Lorient perimeter. Every man in that patrol was killed, wounded, or captured. That was the price of the lesson. The rest of the division absorbed it, and the patrols went on. But the Germans behind the wire could not answer the same way. Farnbacher held his positions. Junk held his. They fired at American patrols when the patrols came, and when the patrols did not come, they sat in silence and listened to nothing. Days passed, then weeks. No bombers overhead, no massed infantry in the tree lines, no tanks grinding through the hedgerows. Just an American observation plane circling lazily in the distance, and the slow, patient knowledge that beyond the wire, an entire army had looked at their fortress and decided it was not worth the trouble. Sit with that thought for a moment. If you served, if your father served, if your grandfather served, you know what soldiers are trained to face. Bullets, shells, cold, hunger, fear, every one of those a man can prepare for, but no army teaches a man how to be ignored. On November 17, 1944, an American named Andrew Gerald Hodges walked into no man's land under a white flag. He was not a soldier. He was a humanitarian representative. He carried papers, not weapons. He negotiated the first prisoner exchange with the Lorient garrison. The Germans handed over 71 Americans. The Americans handed over German wounded. Both sides observed a ceasefire during the transfer. Nobody fired a shot. It was civilized. It was orderly. And it was the quiet moment when both armies admitted, without ever saying the words, the that the war between them had lost its meaning. Behind the wire, 60,000 German soldiers were beginning to understand something their doctrine had never named. Something was starting to rot inside their fortress. Not the concrete, the men. On Christmas Eve, 1944, that rot found a target. 2,235 men of the 66th Infantry Division, the Black Panthers, boarded a Belgian troop ship called the SS Leopoldville in Southampton Harbor. They were bound for Cherbourg. It was a short crossing, 5 hours across the channel. Most of them were from the 262nd and 264th Infantry Regiments. Boys, mostly. Some had been singing Christmas carols below decks. 5.5 miles from Cherbourg Harbor, a German submarine, U-408A6, put a torpedo into her starboard side. The men on deck could see the lights of the harbor. She began to list. HMS Brilliant came alongside and took off 500 men. When the destroyer turned back for a second run, the Leopoldville was gone. She had rolled over and gone down in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes. 763 American soldiers died that night. 493 of them were never recovered from the channel. The Army classified the disaster. It ordered the survivors to say nothing. Their letters home were censored for the rest of the war. On New Year's Day, 1945, the 94th packed up and headed east. Patton wanted them. The real war needed them. What was left of the 66th Division was sent to Brittany to replace them, to sit on the same perimeter, to watch the same wire, to follow the same order, to sit on the same perimeter, to watch the same wire, to follow the same order. Contain. Do not assault. These were men who had watched their friends drown 5 miles from shore on Christmas Eve. They wanted a target. They wanted someone to pay. Instead, they were told to sit in the rain and wait. And across the wire, the Germans were watching something even stranger. On January 30th, 1945, inside the besieged port of La Rochelle, the garrison held a movie premiere. The commander was Vice Admiral Ernst Schurlitz. He had 22,000 men. He assembled as many as could fit in a requisitioned hall and showed them a film. The film was Kolberg, a full-color propaganda epic. It told the story of a Prussian city that had held out against Napoleon in 1807. It was meant to inspire. It was meant to steel their hearts for a final stand. German soldiers watched it in a French port they could not leave, surrounded by an enemy that would not come, defending submarine pens that had no submarines left to shelter. By January of 1945, 113,000 German soldiers were locked inside fortress ports along the French Atlantic coast, enough to fill 8 full-strength divisions. On the Eastern Front, entire German army groups were being replaced by schoolboys and old men. In the Ardennes, the last offensive had already burned itself out. And in Brittany, 113,000 trained soldiers sat behind concrete walls and guarded nothing. Every man behind that wire was a man Germany could no longer send anywhere else. But Brittany was a rehearsal. A proof of concept at the far edge of the map. What the Americans had learned there, patience as a weapon, was about to be applied on a scale that would break an entire German army group. On March 7th, 1945, a sergeant named Alexander Drebik ran across the Ludendorff Bridge at Ramcke and became the first American soldier to set foot on the far bank of the Rhine. The bridge was wired, the charges fired, the bridge shuddered and held. Within days, an entire American corps was across. General Omar Bradley looked at the map. He saw geometry. If First Army pushed north and Montgomery pushed east after crossing the Rhine, the two forces would meet somewhere behind the Ruhr. And everything between them, every division, every headquarters, every factory would be trapped. Montgomery crossed on March 23rd. Operation Plunder. Set piece. Massive. Methodical. And then the pincers began to close. On April 1st, Easter Sunday, the American 9th and 1st Armies met at the town of Lippstadt. The ring was closed. Inside it sat 317,000 German soldiers, 21 divisions, 24 generals, all of Army Group B. And its commander was Field Marshal Walter Model, 54 years old, Hitler's fireman, the man they sent when a front was collapsing and no one else could save it. He was inside the ring now, and he was about to discover what Farnbacher and Junk had already learned in Brittany. On April 16th, in the burning city of Dusseldorf, a police commander named Franz Jürgens made a decision that would cost him his life. He and a handful of local officials had been watching their city die. They knew the Americans were coming. They knew resistance was pointless. They organized what they called Aktion Rhineland, a civilian handover, surrender the city intact, save what could be saved. For a few hours it looked like it might work. Then the SS arrived. Jürgens was arrested. He was tried in a field court that same afternoon. He and 4 other men were shot against a wall before the sun went down. Inside the pocket, the Germans were now killing Germans to keep a war alive that no one outside the pocket believed in anymore. And Field Marshal Walter Model was about to ask his staff a question, and that would decide the fate of every man inside that ring. The squeeze began on April 5th, 1945. It was not a battle in any sense the German army recognized. It was pressure, constant, methodical, inescapable. The Americans advanced from the north and the south at the same time, and the fist began to close. Over 18 days, American artillery fired roughly 1 million shells into the Ruhr pocket. 1 million. Sit with that number. It means that every hour, day and night, thousands of rounds were falling somewhere inside the ring, on roads, on rail junctions, on bridges, on factory yards, on anything that moved and many things that did not. The shells did not only kill soldiers. They ruptured water mains. They cut power lines. They collapsed the sewers. The sewers, they set factories on fire and left them burning because there was no one left to put them out. Within a week, entire cities inside the pocket had no water, no electricity, no working anything. And above the artillery, the fighter bombers circled. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, hunting anything on the roads in daylight. A single German truck drew strafing runs within minutes. Movement in daylight became suicide. Units that needed to shift from one sector to another waited for darkness, then crept along cratered roads, clogged with refugees and abandoned vehicles, and the wreckage of units that had tried to move before them. Field Marshal Walter Model tried to counterattack. Every attempt died before it started. He issued orders to the divisions that no longer existed as coherent units. He shifted reserves that had no fuel to reach the front. He was fighting a war of telephones and couriers inside a pocket where the telephone lines were cut, and the couriers could not reach their destinations. He requested permission from Hitler to break out. Hitler refused. The Ruhr was now a Festung, that word again, and a Festung was to be held to the last man. Model obeyed. He promised his troops reinforcements he knew would never come. He promised wonder weapons that he knew did not exist. And inside the pocket, 317,000 men began to learn what the 60,000 in Brittany had already learned 9 months earlier. Silence from an enemy who could kill you and simply chose not to was worse than any barrage. On April 14th, the 116th Panzer Division, the Greyhounds, one of the finest armored forces Germany had ever fielded, filed its status report. No serviceable tanks, no artillery ammunition, no fuel. It had, in the flat language of military reporting, ceased to exist as a combat-effective unit. It had not been overrun. It had not been defeated in a tank battle. It had been squeezed until there was nothing left to squeeze. That same afternoon, American loudspeaker trucks drove up to the perimeter and began broadcasting in clear German. They did not threaten annihilation. They did not promise punishment. They offered coffee. They offered food, they offered medical treatment, and they offered the one thing no German officer could give, a reason to believe that tomorrow would be different from today. Men who had fought from Normandy to the Bulge walked toward American lines carrying white handkerchiefs. One of them, when an American sergeant asked him why he was surrendering, gave an answer that carried no defiance and no shame. He said, "What is the point in this? I have a wife and children, 5 words, plain, exhausted, human." That was the sound of the Festung doctrine breaking, not under bombardment, not under assault, under the weight of its own emptiness. On April 15th, in a forest headquarters east of Duisburg, Walter Model gathered what remained of his staff. According to his surviving staff officers, he asked them a question. Not a tactical question, not a logistical question, a question no German field marshal had ever needed to ask in the middle of a battle. He asked whether everything had been done to justify their actions in the light of history. Staff said yes, everything had been done. Model then issued the most extraordinary order of the war on the Western Front. He did not surrender Army Group B. A German field marshal does not surrender. That was the code, the oath, the weight of a Prussian tradition that stretched back to Frederick the Great. Instead, he dissolved it. He formally disbanded the Army Group. He released the youngest soldiers, the boys under 18, and told them to go home. He told the Volkssturm to take off their uniforms and disappear into the civilian population. He told his officers they were free to surrender individually, to attempt escape individually, to keep fighting individually. The choice was theirs. Army Group B ceased to exist as a legal entity, and it worked exactly as Model intended. Without a command structure, there was no one to give orders. Without orders, there was no obligation to fight. And without obligation, 317,000 German soldiers did what men do when the structure holding them in place disappears. They surrendered. They came in waves, hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. They came down the roads in columns so long that American units could not process them fast enough. They came with their hands up, their helmets off, their eyes on the ground. 24 German generals walked into American captivity from the Ruhr pocket. More general officers than most armies capture in an entire war. The Americans herded them into open fields along the Rhine. There were no camps large enough, no buildings, just fields ringed with wire, stretching to the horizon, filled with men sitting on the ground. The Germans called them the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. From the air, they looked like gray lakes. Up close, they were 250,000 men with nothing. No shelter, no latrines, no war left, staring at a sky that no longer contained anything trying to kill them. American intelligence had estimated 150,000 prisoners inside the pocket. The actual count was 317,000. The difference, those extra 167,000 men, was a measure of how completely the German army had lost track of itself. There was one man who did not walk into the Rhine meadow camps. On April 21st, 6 days after he had dissolved his army, Model was still moving through the forest east of Duisburg with a small group of staff officers. He was not trying to escape. He was not trying to reach German lines. There were no German lines. He was walking through a landscape that no longer had a war in it, carrying a rank that no longer commanded anything. Somewhere between the villages of Lintorf and Wedau, he stopped. He turned to the officers around him. He told them to go, to surrender, to find their families. Most of them did. One stayed. Model spoke to him briefly. Then he drew his personal sidearm, walked alone into the trees, and shot himself. He was 54 years old. He had commanded armies on 3 fronts. He had stabilized more collapsing sectors than any general in the Wehrmacht. And in the end, the thing that killed him was not a bullet from an American rifle. It was the space between an oath he could not break and a reality he could not change. The assault he had been trained to resist never came. The honorable death in battle that his code promised was never offered. The Americans had simply waited, and in waiting, they had taken from Walter Model the only 2 things a German field marshal had left: the ability to fight and the ability to surrender. He chose the only exit that remained. His body was buried where it fell. It was not found for years. 200 miles to the west, the fortresses outlasted him. On May 8, 1945, the day Germany officially surrendered, the garrison at Lorient was still holding. Lieutenant General Wilhelm Farnbacher ignored the ceasefire. He ignored Grand Admiral Dönitz's surrender directive. He held Festung Lorient for 2 more days. He surrendered on May 10th, 72 hours after the war was officially over. At Saint-Nazaire, Lieutenant General Hans Junk surrendered the following day, May 11th. These were the last German soldiers to lay down their arms on French soil. They had been trapped for 9 months. They had been contained by a force that never seriously tried to take their fortress. They had spent those 9 months accomplishing nothing, defending nothing, waiting for a relief that was never coming. Not one of them had been defeated in battle. Every one of them had been defeated by patience. And that is the answer to the question in the title. It is simpler than it sounds, and more devastating than any weapon the Americans deployed. The German military was the most doctrinally sophisticated army in the world. It had a system for everything: a system for attack, a system for defense, a system for retreat, for encirclement, for breakout, for delay. Every situation had a trained response. Every situation except one. There was no chapter for an enemy who refused to engage. No doctrine for a siege where the besieger simply waited. No response for the moment. A Festung commander realized that his fortress had not attracted an attack. It had attracted indifference. The German system was built for war as a dialogue, action and reaction, blow and counter-blow. When the Americans stopped talking, the system had nothing to say back. At Brest, the Americans had played the role the Germans expected. They had attacked. 10,000 casualties, a ruined harbor. Exactly the exchange rate Hitler had designed the doctrine to produce, but the Americans learned. They learned that the cost of attacking a fortress was the fortress's whole purpose, that every casualty was a victory for the defender, no matter who held the ground at the end. And they learned the alternative. At Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, Patience locked 113,000 men out of the war. For 9 months. At the Ruhr, Patience broke 317,000 men and 24 generals in 18 days. Somewhere in a forest near Duisburg, a field marshal understood this before anyone else. He looked at the pocket closing around him and recognized that the enemy had found the one move for which his entire career had no answer. He could not fight an army that would not charge. He could not hold a line against a force content to let that line shrink by itself. He asked his staff if everything had been done in the light of history, but history had already answered. The deadliest thing the Americans ever did to the trapped divisions of the Wehrmacht was the simplest thing imaginable. They waited. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If your father, your uncle, your grandfather served in the Second World War, I would be honored to hear his name in the comments. These stories belong to all of us.